bombshell admission Thursday afternoon coming from acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.
Hey, guys.
Mulvaney acknowledged Trump held back aid for Ukraine in part to pressure Ukraine to look into allegations about a debunked 2016 election conspiracy theory.
I was involved with the process by which the money was held up temporarily, okay? 3 issues for that. The corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice.
To be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
Quid pro quo is a Latin phrase that means exchanging a favor for a favor. Trump has repeatedly denied such an exchange ever happened.
There was no quid pro quo. There was no quid pro quo.
A summary of Trump's July call with Ukraine's leader shows he brought up both Biden and the conspiracy theory mentioned by Mulvaney. A swift reaction from the Democrat leading the impeachment probe.
Things have just gone from very, very bad to much, much worse.
The acting White House Chief of Staff today appeared to undercut the president's claim that there was no quid pro quo in the decision to withhold aid to Ukraine. That issue was at the heart of the Democrats' impeachment inquiry. Mick Mulvaney was asked directly why the aid was held up. Here's his answer.
President Trump is not a big fan of foreign aid. Never has been, still isn't. Doesn't like spending money overseas, especially when it's poorly spent. And that is exactly what drove this decision. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
Mulvaney said the president wanted Ukraine to assist in the Justice Department's review of how the Russia probe was started. A senior Justice Department official was blindsided by that remark. The official tells CBS News, quote, if the White House was withholding aid in regards to the cooperation with any investigation at the Department of Justice, that is news to us. And the president's attorney, Jay Sekulow, tells CBS News the president's legal counsel was not involved in Mulvaney's press briefing. For weeks now, the president has said there was no quid pro quo and has defended his call for Joe Biden and his son to be investigated. Today, Mulvaney was asked if withholding the aid had anything to do with Biden.
The money held up had absolutely nothing to do with Biden. There's no question. And that was the point I made to you.
President Trump said he did not hear Mulvaney's comments, but praised him while touring a Louis Vuitton factory in Texas.
Did you watch Mick Mulvaney's press conference?
No, I didn't. I wasn't able to see.
Are you aware that he suggested that there was some sort of a quid pro quo involved?
No, I didn't. I heard somebody said he did a very nice job.
Do you know
you know what I've been focused on today very much? All of this, and also if you look, Turkey and the great thing that happened in Syria. I don't know, but Mick is a good man. I don't know. I have not heard anything about it. I have a lot of confidence.
Jeff Mason and Amber Phillips join me now with more. Jeff covers the White House for Reuters, and Amber covers Congress and state houses for the Washington Post. Welcome to you both. Jeff, let me begin with you. Explain to us why this admission from Mick Mulvaney is so significant.
Well, it's significant because it not really underpins it. It goes against everything that the White House has been saying, that Trump has been saying about there not being any quid pro quo. They are essentially admitting here, the chief of staff to President Trump, that there was a political reason for withholding aid to Ukraine. And that goes to the heart of the impeachment inquiry. And that's why Democrats right now are looking into whether or not the president used his political office to achieve political gain.
So, Jeff, to be clear, this could perhaps be seen as an admission of quid pro quo, just not quid pro quo related to Joe Biden.
Well, it's really, yes, and that's the distinction that Mick Mulvaney was trying to make and that the press corps was trying to clarify with him. But it is nonetheless related to a political reason, and it's related to the Democratic National Committee server, that the controversy about it perhaps being in Ukraine or emails being in Ukraine, which is something that has been debunked. That was something that, according to Mick Mulvaney, the president raised and is related to and connected to his decision to withhold aid.
Amber, let me turn to you. There is a clip that I'd like to play from the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, in response to Mick Mulvaney. Let's listen to that.
things have just gone from very, very bad to much, much worse. The idea that vital military assistance would be withheld for such a patently political reason, for the reason of serving the president's reelection campaign, is a phenomenal breach of the president's duty to defend our national security. And I hope that every member, Democrat and Republican, will speak out and condemn this illicit action by the president and his chief of staff.
So, Amber, how should we understand that? Should we expect some kind of change to the impeachment inquiry?
Well, this definitely strengthens and fortifies Democrats' decision to pursue this impeachment inquiry. It could even speed it up because they were bringing in people to ask about quid pro quos, including a top diplomat today. And then you have the acting White House chief of staff out there saying, yeah, we did quid pro quos. Where I'm watching this play out on Capitol Hill is Republicans. They have a decision to make. They have been saying for a while now that this whistleblower complaint and all these allegations were improper and inappropriate, but not illegal. And for many of them, the red line was a quid pro quo. They directly told reporters on Capitol Hill that would be the issue that they find they couldn't support the president anymore for. Mick Mulvaney is trying to hang his hat on this was a quid pro quo, but it was looking back at 2016. We weren't trying to help Trump's reelection. I don't know if that's enough.
All right. So, Jeff, before today, there have been questions about whether Mick Mulvaney could be effective in his role as chief of staff during this impeachment inquiry. Did today's briefing help or hurt?
Well, that will be for the president to decide. I'm smiling because...
Are you hearing anything yet?
No, I'm not. Not so far. But
Okay.
I was going to say that the president is traveling today.
Yeah.
It's certainly very unusual for anyone right now to be giving briefings in the White House press room, and the chief of staff came out and held a pretty substantial briefing. I mean, it was useful, obviously, for the press corps to be able to ask the chief of staff the many questions that we did. I do think it's interesting that he did it on a day when the president's not here, and the fact that it is certainly driving the impeachment story today for all of our news organizations, I suspect is not something that will be pleasing to the president. That said, maybe the president will also conclude that Mulvaney was saying exactly what he needed to say, because another message that we've heard both from the president and from his chief of staff is they don't believe they did anything wrong. The chief of staff made a point today of saying, look, there's always some political influence on foreign policy. That's the result of having an election, and that was the point that he tried to underscore with his comments today.
And Donald Trump's self-dealing hits a level that experts say is an unconstitutional move that could backfire. But we begin with the breaking news rocking the White House and taking the impeachment probe up to an 11. President Trump's top aide just contradicted President Trump, admitting Trump pushed a quid pro quo plot, conditioning Ukraine funding on a political probe involving the DNC.
You were directly involved in the decision to withhold funding from Ukraine. Can you explain to us now definitively why?
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
That's why we held up the money for Ukraine. That's the president's chief of staff, who also runs the budget office, admitting to the think Trump has denied that they did condition the money for Ukraine on the political probe. This is astounding. This is important, and this is rattling the White House tonight, and we'll get to all of that. But I want you to see exactly what just happened. This quid pro quo bribe has now been admitted in plain sight by the guy in charge of the money. So there are tapes. We have them. And as reporters took in an admission so frank and self-incriminating, it seemed more like a Perry Mason episode than real life. They then clarified to the chief of staff. Okay, so just to be clear, the demand for that investigation into the Democrats was why you withheld funding? And Mulvaney said again, yes.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that it was ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation.
There it is. Quid, meet quo. I never knew hustlers confessed in stereo. That's a famous line from Kendrick Jeru Davis that really applies to the news here, given this confession. And in that song, Mr. Davis goes on to talk about people who confess on video, turning out evidence, confession, and fingerprints. So watch what comes out your mouth, or you'll give the DA a case from here to down south. And with all that big willy talk, you're playing yourself. So, do you think Mr. Mulvaney just played himself? Well, today, a reporter gave him one more chance, noting he literally described an illegal quid pro quo, and here was Mulvaney's reply.
What you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
We do it all the time. It's easier to prove a quid pro quo bribe when a suspect admits it. I want to turn to the legal experts we have on this explosive story. Paul Butler and Jennifer Taub, good to see you, and a reporter who was in that briefing room. You see her right here today. Wow, what a room to be in. McClatchy's Francesca Chambers. Good evening, everyone.
Hey, Ari.
Paul.
Hi, Ari.
Hi. Paul, what did we just see in that briefing room? And what would you do with a suspect if you had him on a charge and they talked like that?
I would think this is my lucky day as a prosecutor. It's not every day you get the co-conspirators all admitting to the conspiracy on national television. So here's the thing about...
If you were investigating a case that involved a quid pro quo bribe and you got that, just what we saw there in that interview, would you take them into custody?
I'd arrest, I'd prosecute, and I'd get a big fat conviction because what we have is a confession. So here's the thing. A quid pro quo could actually be legal in some contexts. Nobody has a right to military aid from the United States. And so the United States can condition its aid on legitimate state objectives. So if Trump really were concerned about corruption in Ukraine and he wanted to make sure they were doing something about their own internal politics and good government, he could say, yeah, get that straight, and then we'll give you some military assistance. But you can't do that to advance your own political objectives, and that's what Trump was doing, and that's pretty much what both the acting chief of staff and Solon, one of the three amigos in Ukraine, they both admitted that today.
Jennifer, how do you view this admission in the context of the impeachment probe? Has Mr. Mulvaney just put the White House at the center of the alleged crime that he was, I guess he thought he was defending?
Well, Ari, I don't have rap lyrics today, but I do have William Shakespeare. And I think there's a method to Mulvaney's madness here. Believe it or not, I think he's trying to be a bit clever. All he has admitted at this point that the quid pro quo was about was investigating the Democrats and looking into whether the Ukrainians have the server.
Let me jump in. I'm going to have to jump in because we've got some of the reporting here just to make sure we're all current. Brand new from the White House, a statement from Mr. Mulvaney walking this back. He says, quote, there was no quid pro quo between the military aid and any investigation. And so we just got this, which is striking. You know, these are these kind of breaking news nights. I don't know that he's being clever if he has to rush out the statement. It appears to some degree he goes in there and says, we did a quid pro quo, and now he has to claim the opposite.
Well, it's smart. I mean, there's a method to his madness, but it wasn't a very good method. And to head where I was going with this, I think he initially thought that if he only said the quid pro quo was related to something that happened in 2016 and it was investigating whether Ukrainians had somehow meddled with the election, that he could get away with it. He was intentionally trying to make us forget or distance himself from the other part of the quid pro quo, which was investigating his political rival in the upcoming election.
I'm not sure it's that complicated. let me play a little more of Mr. Mulvaney, because I'm not sure that what we're watching is someone playing three-dimensional chess so much as someone who went out today and said there was a quid pro quo bribe, which in this context looks impeachable, and now is walking it back. Francesca, I want to get you in as well, having been in the room, but take a listen to him talking about political influence in foreign policy and what people should think about that.
Kinney said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it.
Francesca, what did you think of that, and what was it like in that room?
So I was just reading this new statement from the White House that they rushed to us right before they knew that we'd all be going on television for prime time to try and clean up his remarks. He goes on to say that there was never any condition on the flow of aid related to the matter of the DNC server. But as we heard, you played those clips. That is not what he said when we were sitting in the room today.
Yeah, you're building such an important point. I just want you to slow down on it, Francesca. You're saying that part of what he's saying now is a lie, that he has now put out a statement. I'm not asking you to use that term, but I'm going to use that term because I've got the statement. He went out, we just played it, and admitted to a funding quid pro quo bribe for the investigation of this DNC stuff. And now we have a new statement where he's telling everyone that didn't happen.
Well, the White House says it's reporters who are misconstruing his words, which is why I go back to those clips that you played where you heard the question and you heard the direct answer to those questions. And I was also going to add that that was the first briefing that we've had in here. Of course, Secretary Mnuchin has briefed a couple times, but we haven't seen the White House press secretary. This was the first time in a very long time we'd seen someone like Mick Mulvaney brief from that podium. So they were clearly trying to answer the questions surrounding his involvement in what is a billowing scandal for the President of the United States, and then had to even go back to that and play cleanup with the statement we just got.
It's striking, and they're clearly back on their heels. I have a lot of breaking news because of the way this hour is going to go, including some special guests. So I'm bringing in more experts. I want to thank Jennifer very much. Jennifer Taub, other panelists are going to rejoin me, but let me bring you up to speed because we have more reporting as we were just coming out on the air. And as I've mentioned, we've got reaction pouring in to this unfolding crisis. Now, before we bring in the next experts, take a look at how Trump's lawyers right now are handling this. A source telling CNN they're basically stunned at Mulvaney admitting this bribery plot. And here's what's key. Donald Trump has been improvising this impeachment defense. He talks, Mulvaney talks, Trump's lawyers talk, but the lawyers cannot properly defend these suspects in this plot, from Giuliani pushing a quid pro quo to Mulvaney admitting and executing it, if the suspects go rogue and admit to the plot in public. To put it simply tonight, the lawyers are trying to defend. Admitting is the opposite of defending. And so Trump lawyer Jay Sekulow, who we've interviewed right here on this show, he's got a new statement out now that offers a legal drop kick to everything that Mulvaney just admitted. And that makes clear what we heard, what you just saw from Mulvaney. That's not the president's counsel's view. That's not his strategy. Sekulow saying bluntly, quote, "The president's legal counsel was not involved in acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney's press briefing." That is a stark rejection. Now, Mulvaney is a top day-to-day aide to Donald Trump. So a lawyer for Trump doesn't want to rush into antagonizing him or risk their access, but it's clearly an admission this damage had to be addressed immediately. And it's not just Mulvaney. The Ukraine plot was further corroborated today in Congress. Explosive testimony, Ambassador Sondland confirming that Donald Trump was backing the Ukraine policy that Giuliani was driving. Another impeachment witness suggesting Giuliani was aiming to be something of a mastermind of Ukraine policy and Donald Trump's politics. And then Mulvaney today, you got to see this, doubled down on Giuliani in that disastrous appearance.
Do you believe that Rudy Giuliani's role as an outside advisor to the president is problematic?
No, that's the president's call. The president gets to set foreign policy, and he gets to choose who to do so.
Did the president direct you or anyone else to work with Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine?
The president asked Rick Perry to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Appropriate for a personal attorney to be working in Ukraine on issues that are supposed to be national issues.
I don't know of anything inappropriate about that.
As promised, I'm adding to our lineup former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner. Francesca Chambers, who is reporting from that same room, is still with us. Glenn, your reaction to the significance of these admissions?
You know, Ari, when Mulvaney started to talk and started to confess that there was a quid pro quo, I wasn't that shocked because to me, It looks like one of our sort of tested, tried and true trial tactics. We call it drawing the sting. What you do is, and he's talking to the American people, because at least as long as Bill Barr is Attorney General, ain't nobody getting charged with a crime who is a crony of the president.
Do you
right?
think it adds to the impeachment evidence against Donald Trump to have the guy in charge of the budget say that they withheld funding from Ukraine to get a political investigation?
It adds to the impeachment evidence. I'm not so sure it adds to the removal evidence. And here's why. Once we go from impeachment in the House to a removal trial in the Senate, he's actually blunting the force of what the American people are going to hear in that Senate trial.
You think he's trying to get something negative out?
He is trying to draw the sting from that
I guess
information.
if that's right, then why is he backing off it?
Well, that's what I don't understand, because once he has drawn the sting, he is taking the stinger and he's reinserting it in his own arm. So none of this makes any sense to me now.
I got lawyers thinking 3 moves ahead, and it looks like Mick Mulvaney is about 2 moves behind.
Yeah, and these are Keystone crooks at this point.
Both of you hang with me. I want to bring in Congressman Swalwell, who sits on the Judiciary and Intelligence Committees. What do you think we saw today?
Well, good evening, Ari. First, I would be remiss if I didn't just quickly pay tribute to my colleague, Elijah Cummings, who was a thunderous presence for equality, accountability, and moral clarity.
I appreciate
I just want to make sure
I appreciate you bringing it up. We're hitting that a little later in the show, but let's begin with that, because you raised such an important moment for, obviously, your colleagues. So we'll get to it later, but let's get to it now as well. If you want to tell us a moment or two of your reflection on it.
Well, sure. I mean, I'll just say there was, he's been a part of this investigation, and there was some thought as to whether we should delay today's hearing. But all of us know that, he has, been such a force for protecting our democracy that he would hate if we delayed just 1 day of getting to the truth. So we are marching on, doing what he would want us to do. And so, yes, today on a break from hearing from Ambassador Sondland, I'm standing right outside the SCIF, the secure room where we're meeting with him. And on the big screen, you see Mick Mulvaney holding this press conference, and there was just jaws on the floor, including my Republican colleagues, as Mick Mulvaney said that. Yes.
So you saw that? I haven't heard that. You saw Republicans in real time. It's not like they had extra time to frame it. You're saying their first reaction was what?
They're shaking their heads, and and I patted one of them on the shoulder and I said, "Have fun cleaning that one up." But Ari, the way I see it is Mick Mulvaney today co-signed on Donald Trump's confession to extortion.
You view it as a type of confession?
Yes. We've always known, Donald Trump said it was a quid pro quo, essentially. Then they tried to back off once they recognized what that meant for impeachment, removal, and potential criminal liability. But going back to Glenn Kirshner's point, oftentimes it's said in court, how could the defendant be so stupid? And as my brothers who are police officers tell me, we don't catch the smart ones. So I don't think that there's any, brilliant legalese going on here or Jedi tricks. Sometimes they just say the quiet parts out loud.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you put it very starkly, and I think the evidence of that, and we were sort of having that debate out here on the show because we have people with different ideas and talk it out. But when you look at how quickly they're backtracking, the lawyers saying, well, this wasn't our advice, and then Mulvaney with this statement, saying multiple times during this briefing, I took 25 questions. I referred to Trump's interest in rooting out corruption. There was, quote, absolutely no quid pro quo. So now you have Mulvaney admitting quid pro quo. We just showed that. Then later claiming he didn't, which is a lie. And we know it's a lie because of the basis of which he admitted. And then the question becomes, what do your committees do about this? Do you feel any need to hear further from Mulvaney under oath before you move to votes? And what happens if he doesn't show? Because the Stonewall strategy we've seen cracking a little bit.
Well, suspects who confess to a crime are still entitled to a fair hearing. So we're going to give the president a fair hearing. You can move a lot faster when you have confessions from the suspects and other witnesses around it. But yes, we're going to bring in the relevant witnesses and conduct this fairly but expeditiously. I also just want to say this, Ari, about what we heard from Mick Mulvaney, which is, of course, this is what they were doing. And the process attacks that I hear from Republicans reflect that they don't want to defend what was actually going on, the extortion scheme with our taxpayer dollars. And as you know, Ari, as a lawyer, law professors tell you, when the facts are against you, argue the law. When the law is against you, argue the facts. And when both are against you, just pound your fists on the table and shout really loud. And that's what I think we're seeing right now.
I want to ask you something else, because you're involved in this, you're an investigator, and you're around all these individuals. We were watching this in the newsroom today, and we were just astounded. I mean, I could not understand how the president's top aide, who's been listening to Donald Trump run around and say no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo, would come out and admit it. And we just played that sound. And then pressed by the reporters, wait, are you really admitting this? He did. Do you have, and does it matter to your investigation to have a theory of why this is happening? In other words, is there a bubble? Is the lack of regular press briefings made a lot of people soft? Is there really a lack of experience at this point with Mr. Mulvaney taking straightforward, inquisitive questions and thus fumbling them? Because it seems that in a very appreciable way, some of the best public evidence that there was a bribery plot with Ukraine just burst out today, and it came from the president's top aide.
It's a great question. I think you can sum it up with the fact that this July 25 shakedown call was made the day after Bob Mueller testified to Congress. They think they can get away with it. That's really what's at stake here. There's not really a dispute about what happened. And so what I submit to my Republican colleagues is our children are watching what we do next with our democracy. Donald Trump said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. And we as Americans have to answer whether he is right about who we are. I am betting that he's really, really wrong.
You lay out the stakes. It's really striking. And it was interesting also what you were saying you saw from your colleagues. And I also appreciate you speaking about a colleague that you lost. Really appreciate your time today, Congressman Swalwell.
Thanks so much, Ari. My pleasure.
Also want to thank Glenn Kirshner and Paul Butler, who've been in the mix as well.